Imagine being in a mall, just going about your day when suddenly you're accused of something you didn't do. That's exactly what happened to Mrs. Ruby, an elderly woman who was harassed by security officers. But little did they know, her son was about to show up. What happened next left everyone stunned. Stay tuned to find out how this dramatic story unfolds. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from viewers all around the world. It was a peaceful afternoon at the mall. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, a kind and elderly black woman, was spending her afternoon shopping for her usual groceries. The 70-year-old woman, with soft gray hair and a quiet, calming presence, always carried herself with grace, even when her body didn't move as fast as it used to. Mrs. Ruby's cane clicked rhythmically on the tiled floor as she made her way through the aisles, her gentle smile brightening her face. Her shopping trip was almost over, and her bags were filled with simple items, some bread, milk, vegetables, and her favorite tea. She moved carefully, her legs feeling a bit tired. Despite her age, she still tried to remain as independent as possible, preferring to handle her errands by herself. As she approached the exit, her pace slowed, and she took a deep breath, enjoying the moment of calm before heading home. Suddenly, two security officers, dressed in dark uniforms with stern faces, blocked her path. They were large men, towering over her, and their faces looked cold and suspicious. Mrs. Ruby, startled, looked up at them with wide eyes. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you," one of the officers said in a low, accusing voice. He crossed his arms as he stood in front of her, making it clear that they weren't going to let her pass. Mrs. Ruby blinked, confused. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "We've received reports that you were shoplifting," the other officer added sharply. His tone was harsh, almost as if he had already decided she was guilty. Mrs. Ruby's smile faded. Shoplifting. Her. The accusation stung, making her heart race even more. Her fingers clutched the handle of her cane a little tighter. "No, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I paid for all of my things." She reached into her bag, trying to pull out her receipt, her hands shaking with nervousness. She found it and held it up, but the officers didn't even bother to look at it. "We need you to come with us," the first officer said firmly, ignoring her attempt to show them she had done nothing wrong. Mrs. Ruby felt her stomach twist in knots. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. Why wouldn't they just check her receipt and let her go? She had always been so careful, always doing everything the right way. Why were they treating her like this? But I didn't steal anything." She tried to explain again, her voice shaking more now. She felt panic rising in her chest. They weren't listening. Without warning, one of the officers reached out and grabbed her arm. The sudden grip made her flinch, and she nearly dropped her cane. "Let's go," he said, pulling her toward the back of the store. Mrs. Ruby felt her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't believe this was happening. She tried to pull her arm free, but the officer's grip was too strong. "Please," she begged, "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers didn't care. They pulled her harder, and the pain shot through her old, tired body. She glanced around the mall, hoping someone, anyone, would come to her aid. People were watching, but no one moved. They just stood there, whispering to one another, casting judgmental glances. Mrs. Ruby felt utterly alone. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had never been in trouble before, never even raised her voice to anyone. And now, here she was, being dragged through the mall like a criminal. It was humiliating. It was terrifying. Her breathing grew shallow, and her vision blurred as the tears began to spill over. Her purse, hanging loosely from her arm, slipped down, and in the struggle, her phone tumbled out and hit the floor with a soft thud. The officer kept dragging her toward the back room, not even noticing. But Mrs. Ruby noticed. Her heart skipped a beat. Her son, Oliver, her strong, brave son, had told her to call him if she ever needed help, and she needed him now more than ever. With shaky hands, she reached down and grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to unlock it. The officers were pulling her, but she managed to press the call button, dialing her son's number. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally, a click. "Mom." Oliver's deep voice came through the line. Mrs. Ruby's voice trembled as she whispered into the phone, her tears now streaming down her face. "Oliver, please come. They're hurting me. I don't know what to do." She could barely get the words out, but Oliver understood. "I'm coming, Mom. Hold on. I'm coming." He arrived at the mall within minutes, his pulse quickening as he parked hastily. He marched inside, scanning the area until he spotted her, his mom, being pushed around by two security officers near the back of a store. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. His mother looked small and fragile between the two burly men, her face streaked with tears. They had their hands on her, gripping her arms, and were dragging her toward a back room like she was a criminal. His heart thundered with a mixture of rage and sorrow. His sweet mother, who had never hurt a soul, was being treated like this. A fire ignited in his chest, but he knew he had to stay calm. Oliver inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He couldn't let his emotions take over. He was trained for high-pressure situations, and this was no different. But deep inside, his heart was screaming. As he made his way toward them, his eyes never left the officers. His steps were firm, his fists clenched by his sides. He could feel his blood boiling, but his face remained stone cold. His mother's safety was all that mattered now. "Mom," Oliver called, his voice deep and controlled, though it took everything in him to keep it that way. Mrs. Ruby, though clearly shaken, looked up at the sound of her son's voice, her tear-filled eyes widening in relief. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice cracking. Captain Johnson walked right up to the officers, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His presence alone seemed to draw the attention of the crowd that had gathered nearby. But the security officers didn't seem to notice or care. "This is none of your business, sir," one of the officers said curtly, glaring at Oliver. He clearly thought Oliver was just another upset bystander. "Step back, or we'll have to take action." Oliver clenched his jaw, trying to contain the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. His dark eyes narrowed as he looked directly at the officer, his voice steady but commanding. "It is my business. That's my mother." The officer blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sheer authority in Oliver's voice. But instead of backing down, the officer tightened his grip on Mrs. Ruby's arm, almost as if to prove a point. Oliver's hands balled into fists at his sides. He wanted to knock the man's hand off his mother, but he kept his cool. He had to handle this right. "Your mother," the other officer scoffed. "Doesn't matter. She's suspected of theft, and we're taking her to the back to deal with it. Now, unless you want to get involved in this mess, I suggest you leave." Oliver felt the fire in his chest roar even louder, but still, he kept his voice calm. "She's done nothing wrong. You can check the receipt in her bag. But before you do anything else, you need to let go of her." The officers exchanged a glance, growing more defensive. The first officer took a step toward Oliver, puffing up his chest. He clearly had no idea who he was dealing with. "You need to back off now, sir, or we'll have to call the police." Oliver almost smiled at the absurdity of the situation. "Call the police?" he asked. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated, unsure of how to respond to Oliver's calm confidence. But instead of backing down, he tried to double down, hoping to intimidate Oliver into leaving. "I don't think you understand how serious this is. If you interfere, we'll have you arrested too." At this, Oliver's eyes darkened. His patience had just about run out. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge and holding it up for the officers to see. "I am Captain Oliver Johnson, 15th Precinct," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You will let go of my mother." Both officers froze, their eyes wide in shock. It was as if the floor had just dropped out from under them. They stammered, stumbling over their words, their faces turning pale as they processed what had just happened. This wasn't just some random man. This was a police captain, a man who outranked every single person they could call. "Captain," one of the officers sputtered, releasing Mrs. Ruby's arm. "We didn't know, sir. We were just following orders." Oliver stepped closer, towering over the officers now. His mother was safe, but the anger he had kept at bay was now simmering just beneath the surface. He stared the men down, his gaze sharp enough to cut through stone. "You didn't know," Oliver repeated, his voice soft but dangerous. "You didn't think to ask, did you? You didn't think to check the receipt, to listen to her, or to treat her with respect." The officers were speechless. One of them tried to stammer an apology, but Oliver silenced him with a sharp look. "What if this was your mother?" Oliver asked, his voice tight with emotion. "What if she was the one being treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of strangers? Would you still be so quick to lay your hands on her?" The officers' faces were flushed now, their eyes wide with fear and regret. They had no answer. They had been wrong, and they knew it. Oliver turned to his mother, his expression softening as he gently took her hand. "Are you okay, Mom?" Mrs. Ruby, still shaken, nodded slowly. "I'm okay now, Oliver," she whispered, her voice trembling. Oliver squeezed her hand reassuringly, then turned back to the officers. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs about this," he said coldly. "Get out of my sight." Without another word, the officers backed away, their heads hung low in shame. Oliver wrapped his arm around his mother's shoulders and led her out of the store. His heart still pounded in his chest, but his mother was safe, and that was all that mattered. Mrs. Ruby clutched Oliver's arm, her body still trembling from the fear and humiliation. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, son," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. The weight of the moment hit Oliver hard, his heart aching for his mother. She had always been so strong, so proud, and to see her treated this way filled him with a deep sorrow. As Oliver and Mrs. Ruby left the mall, the weight of the ordeal still hung in the air, but so did a sense of satisfaction. The officers would be held accountable for their actions, and justice would be served. And while Mrs. Ruby's heart still ached from the hurt she had endured, she knew one thing for certain. Her son, her brave and loyal son, had made things right. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next story. Join our community and stay tuned for more amazing content.